everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Thank you very much. My great pleasure to introduce Larissa McLean Davies from, I get this exactly right, the Executive Dean of Education and Arts at the Australian Catholic University.
Well done, Andy.
I've known her a long time, but this is her longest title. And she was Dean, Associate Dean at Melbourne before, and so on. But I have to say, what's really, quite strange about Larissa.
Only one thing.
And a lovely person, and that's a rare one. Yeah, academics show the honesty. It's a rare combination. No, and again, I'm not going to tell you all the things you can read on the web about. But I have to say that she is a remarkably talented scholar and an exceptional leader. And the burden of leadership in things like education and management is very significant because it eats away at your mind, takes up masses of time, masses of meetings. So to continue to do good research in our field, to publish it, but to also support other people, PhD students, mentor them, develop them, give your time to those people. It's an incredibly difficult balancing act. For marriage, but Larissa does it brilliantly. She's a model to us all. And two things you don't know about her, she's also not only an extraordinarily accomplished musician, but she has produced two young men, these boys, who are even more talented in music.
True.
They are prodigiously talented. And so a family as well, all those things. But tonight we're here because of her scholarship. And she's going to talk about that, so I'm not going to try and summarise it in advance. But I've known her for a long time, and her commitment to the concept of literature, its importance, is absolutely substantial, important, very important, not just in Australia, but internationally, and that's why she's here today. That's why we're so delighted to welcome her. I hope you enjoyed the talk. There should be the usual format, about 40 minutes or so. A few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes? Do I need to hold it up? Is that better? Kind of like I'm going to sing a song. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andy, for that warm welcome. And thank you, colleagues, for being here at the end of the day when we have been warm and tired. And also we have the wonderful Debbie Myhill in the auditorium. And I also wish we could all be in two places at once, but it's lovely to be here. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the conference organisers for inviting me to give this keynote. I've been coming to the ALI conference since 2013 when I was a younger academic, and I feel like this is the community that I've really learnt to think with. And I've also been part of the IFTI community as well and really enjoyed and got a lot from those conferences. I want to say a little bit about ALI though, because ALI is the way in which we're learning about language and literature and literacies in contexts really different to our own. And there's something so extraordinary about that opportunity. Yes, of course, internationally teaching English is also fantastic, but having these then two together, giving us the chance to think differently and think with others is a great gift. So I want to thank the conference organisers and Javier here for putting this together for us. And Andy said the things that we all balance. Well, I think it's one of the great privileges of my life to be an academic and be able to be in this space. And here we are in Barcelona, so what a privilege that is. So this title, hopefully a little bit provocative, the author is alive and you can text them, is what we're going to be talking about today, and I'll be sharing somewhat of my thinking around questions of literary sociability, the role and purpose of the teaching of literature in L1, and some of the journey, I guess, that I've been on since early 2013, thinking through some of these ideas. What I'd like to do, though, before I begin with the talk is to acknowledge that the work that I undertake is largely on the unceded Indigenous lands in Australia. So we talk about L1. Now, L1 has a very unusual or perhaps unsettled meaning in the Australian context. So these are Indigenous languages in Australia. And how many Australians have we got here in the room? Laura, colleague, thank you. Excellent. So this is a familiar map or it will be a familiar map to those in the room. And the reason that we often show this is to remind ourselves that the divisions of boundary, or being unbounded or boundary without boundaries, is something that is significant for us, and it's helpful for us in rethinking what are the boundedness and boundaries that we subscribe to our own understanding and existence. So in showing you this map and thinking about the more than 200 language groups that have or are currently sleeping in Australian culture because of colonisation, I acknowledge that I do, as I said, take my research, the opportunity of my research on unceded Indigenous lands, particularly the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations. And I acknowledge all Indigenous peoples here with us today, and acknowledge elders past and present, and acknowledge that in all our contexts there are peoples who are speaking multiple languages, and that notion of L1 itself is somewhat of a tension in these places. I come to you not able to speak any of these languages. In fact, the closest other language I can speak is German, which says something about the way in which things travel around Australia and how we might have colonised this nation and thought about this nation differently. So beginning in that way. So the title of the talk, which I've shared with you, is really thinking about the purpose and the role of literature in education. And this is something that troubles me, that occupies me, that I'm so privileged to be thinking with Andy, with Velda, through the Literary Lab, which Velda's a part of, and with others here in this room, and with my fantastic PhD student Grace at the back there. So these are the kind of things that we're thinking about, that I've been thinking about for a long time. And so this title comes from this: literature as context and intertext. Literature as providing a context for society. Literature as a method of understanding the world, in itself giving knowledge, in itself understanding, in itself a kind of rigour. And then literature as knowledge. What is the knowledge? Is there literary knowledge? And this is a question that has occupied me significantly. And I think in a time where we know that it is important for multiple voices to be heard in society, where our literature and the literature we share in our classrooms is under question in some contexts, is debated, and a lot of my time has been spent, for want of a better hobby, looking at curriculum documents and looking at text selection lists and thinking very deeply about that. But these are the questions, or these are the areas that I continue to want to animate in this space. So I want to share that with you, because this is what's coming behind my question or my provocation. The author is alive, and you can text them. Literary sociability in contemporary L1 education. It really should have the question mark there as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about literary sociability. So this notion of literary sociability, and for those of you who are interested in the teaching of literature, this is not necessarily something that's quite radical, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. So literary sociability was a construct that came to me and to those that I was working with, including Brenton Dakey, who some of you will know through this community. In fact, we were speaking about it at the 2015 ALI conference. This was our conversation on the bus when we were going from UNS to the dinner, the conference dinner, which we're going to go to tomorrow night. We were thinking a lot about literary sociability because earlier this book, Republics of Letters, had come out in Australia, 2012. Literary studies academics, Peter Kirkpatrick and Robert Dixon, had really tried to think about how literary knowledge, how literature circulates in communities. And even though they were in universities, they were thinking about we're not understanding literature in the real world. Now, for those of us who are teachers in classrooms, we would probably agree that literary studies academics are somewhat separate sometimes to the activities of classrooms or to the activities of communities. But this was a kind of slightly radical move in 2012, where Kirkpatrick and Dixon were refuting canonical great books notions, emphasising reading groups, magazines, salons, libraries, formal networks and coteries, focusing on audiences and readerships, and thinking about the communities and the social structures that were enabling literature to circulate in real life, IRL, we now use that term, but in real life, how was literature circulating and what did it mean? And really, even though they don't reference Bart, who is kind of referenced, as you can see in my title, they really did assume that the author, if not dead, was slightly diffused, that the author and their voice was kind of just one, perhaps amongst the conversation of book groups. And so those who are familiar with Bart's Death of the Author in Text, Music, Image, I might have that in the wrong way, you'll know that there's that famous line about the author being dead and the reader being alive. 1977 is that text. And of course, I don't think Bart really thought the author was dead, but did think that we should pay less attention to the author, that we should be less concerned about what the author was thinking, reading, saying, or doing. And so this idea of literary sociability took that up and was saying, well, the authors, we've moved on from that, and now we're looking at, well, where do we get meaning from text? We get them in book groups, we get it in community libraries, we get it in all kinds of different places outside the academy, and what does that mean for the academy? We'll just go on to the next one. There's someone else in 1977, that's a little Larissa in her own little book group. So the idea of literary sociability, of bringing together something in the same year that Bart was talking, just so happens that I have that photo. I mean, you can see there, you could do your own post-colonial, decolonial reading of that particular image where I have Mickey Mouse and the Wombles and everything around me in Australia, but that's not the purpose of this talk. You'll see that we know literary sociability and community reading since 2012 has actually skyrocketed, that there are more book groups. In fact, who's in a book group? Could you put up your hand if you're in a fiction book group? Interestingly, not as many as I might have thought. I'm often excluded from them, just sharing that, largely because people think I'll destroy their enjoyment of the text when I give my own particular reading. But we do know that there are so many book groups, and you see the text here, 270 formally registered book clubs in libraries and local councils around, just from the Centre of Adult Education. Eventbrite's hosted book club events 350% more since 2020. In the USA, 21% of Gen Z and 29% of millennials report belonging to a book club. So we know this idea of sociability is out there. And so the question for us is, who are interested in literary education, where does that go then? What does this mean for our thinking about literary education? And is this the same as Bart's the author being dead, meaning being made outside of authorship, etc., etc.? So stay with me. This is where we are going. So here we have a couple of reminders of, in fact, the nature of literary sociability in real life. We have book talks. Now, I don't know how many of you are on TikTok. Yes, we've got one. Excellent. 2. Everyone else is looking vaguely around saying, is that the same as Instagram? No, it's a different thing entirely. But this notion of people connecting in little videos of themselves reading, it's thrilling stuff as well. So book talk is something. Here we have, again in this sort of 2012 time, this is another, just one of the many examples. This is the Tough Guy Book Club that only happens in pubs. And this is where it's reframing conversations in pubs about important things that we take from literature. And you'll remember one of my questions was literature as knowledge, literature as method, and literature as context and intertext. So we know that from this idea of literary sociability that it is exploding, and it has exploded in our world. Here we have my last example, which is a reading rave at Revolver, which is a nightclub in Melbourne. So you can go there, and whilst other people will be doing what they do at raves, you can go for a reading kind of rave at Revolver. So this is all very contemporary. People are looking around Grace is saying, not really, who would go to Revolver at all, let alone for a rave? But the point, I guess, here is when we're thinking about contemporary cultures and the reading of literature, and we're thinking it happens in classrooms when we open up the book, this is a completely different way of thinking about literary sociability, or an extension of that. Now, if we go back to that 2012, Kirkpatrick and Dixon, we were very taken as a research team around this idea of literary sociability. And of course, it continues outside. And we were very interested in thinking not about book clubs like out there at Revolver or on Book Talk, but we were interested in the classroom and sociability in the classroom. And we were interested in thinking in this way, and Brenton Dakey and Philip Mead wrote about it from our research. Literary sociability prompts us to reconceptualise classrooms as interpretive sites. So again, we're thinking about what is this link between the idea of sociability, and remember, we've just got a through line happening here about the author not really being alive, and I'm coming back to that. But this idea of sociable reading practices happening in classrooms, and is this different? Does this do something for us traditionally, or different to traditional didactic kind of approaches? And here we have, and Peter here is probably thinking that is not the way, to quote Vygotsky here, is exactly what I said not to do in this morning's lecture. But in a paper that we published, we were talking about this notion of collaborative work. Thought does not develop independently, but through a mediation of signs and cultural instruments. And so we were thinking very much about how this concept of sociability is really relevant and important in the classroom. And so a lot of our earlier work, which ultimately a couple of years ago culminated in this book, Literary Knowing in the Making of English Teachers, was testing those ideas of sociability. One of the things we found in that, which was quite significant, we felt at the time, was that it didn't matter so much what happened in the classroom, it also really mattered what sociable connections the teacher had outside the classroom. What were their literary, sociable kind of experiences that they were bringing to the classroom at the time. So now let's think about the dead and the silent author, because what I'm arguing is this notion of sociability is reliant on the author being a little bit silent, the reader making meaning, and in fact then it's not so different to lots of ways we've been thinking about growth through English or making meaning. It's about the individual making a sense of it. The difference around sociability is it's very much a communal meaning making, which is why we thought this was important for the classroom. Why are we looking at this now? Yet another chance for me to show a little photo of myself from a different period of time. This is 1986. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because in Australia, this book had important kind of carriage called The Making of Literature. It was the early time of thinking about the way in which we might think differently. It's not a gallery. We don't walk into a classroom and admire the book like a gallery. Ian Reid suggested we need to have a workshop, that we are making literature, that students are making literature themselves. And again, this time we do quote Barth and we do say the author is dead. Hooray, relief, release. We are out there and students and teachers, mainly students, are making their own meaning. I was at school at this time, as you can see, doing this kind of work, and we had poetry like this. We were looking at from Chaucer to Plath, and we weren't really interested in the real about what Chaucer or Plath thought. We knew a bit about the biography, but I remember and think about the ways in which we were mostly drawing on our own experiences. We were making the meaning, and this was the real value. So the author was, if not dead, just a little bit further away. So literary sociability, very common perhaps in classroom practice, a little bit of a different flavour as we think about book clubs. We're still not quite getting, though, the difference that the book club idea or the author as being present in a book club, which is an important thing to consider, might actually now impact on us. So just briefly, and this is my version as a new academic of Ian Reid's The Making of Literature, might strongly in the margins looking at what might this mean for my pre-service teachers. So readers were filling the gaps as writers. Literature was no longer a special or elite category. Knowledge as an outcome, studying literature is not in any substantial sense to acquire a body of knowledge. So this was all about creating the self through this. So knowledge, knowing something through literature, literature as knowledge was not part of this sociable moment. Pedagogy was very organic, some kind of inkling of it in the classroom, said Ian Reid, and teachers were bringing different ways of thinking to this, and they were laying bare their understanding of the literary work. So this was Ian Reid's view, and a couple of years ago we looked and said, is this still the case? Is this still what's happening in classrooms? More or less, yes. And so again, my question of what does literary sociability, relational meaning making with literature happen at this point, and where's the author? Well, we do know that the author's definitely not dead in classrooms. We know that often we bring in the author to talk about their work to students, and then we just pop that aside. And you might want to think about, why do we bring authors in? Is it to inspire the students that they're actually there? Is it to give them insights? There's a whole range of reasons we might do this, but these are really interesting examples of the author not being dead in classrooms. So in we'll deal with this first one, and there's another example of this. So in the high stakes assessment, the Year 12 HSC, students in some parts of Australia are required to write on literary works they've never seen before, because we think that will help them. Then we will know exactly how clever they are, because they will be able to just read a text they've never read before, bring a reading to it, which will be authentic and valid. In this case, this was a poem by Ocean Vuong, and it was set for the HSC exam. The students were so irritated they had no understanding of it, and we could go into a whole range of why that's problematic, that they then wrote to him through social media and said, what on earth was your poem about? I've failed my HSC exam. It's all a total disaster. So he's definitely alive, but he hadn't been in the classroom, clearly, in any way, shape or form. And he wrote back, bro, Godspeed, bro. Like, what are you even talking about? What is the HSC? I don't know where you are. What is going on, and why are you writing to me in this way? So the author is definitely not dead. Here we have a much more disturbing, even though that is kind of disturbing, even more disturbing example of the author not being dead. So we have, for those of us interested in Indigenous writing, unfortunately that hasn't been strong in Australian classrooms. And we could, that's kind of the most enormous understatement of this talk. But we do have and have had white writers writing about Indigenous issues, and we've popped those in the classroom as well. Jasper Jones is a book that's written by Craig Silvey, but unfortunately, and very disturbingly, we've discovered that Craig Silvey has had practices with young people on the internet that we then want to dispute his text being in our classrooms. And let me tell you, the book Jasper Jones has been read by more Australian students than anyone else. So here we see the author both outside but then brought into the classroom. So we know that for all of these examples, authors are definitely not dead. Here's another example of Ellen van Neerven, an Indigenous writer, who again, this was an example similar to the first one, where we know that she had an unnamed text, or a text that students hadn't read before on the HSC exam. And again, there was a lot of vitriol from students as they wrote to her and connected with her. So what is all this meaning? The author is clearly animated for students. We know that in our society, the author is not dead as we might understand this to be. And in fact, they're in digitally mediated environments, that literary sociability is extending well beyond our classrooms, that it is in fact available to our students. So herein brings in perhaps my most significant thinking about this over the last little while. So Indigenous author Melissa Lukashenko said very powerfully, the author is not dead. More specifically, the Aboriginal author is not dead, a double happiness. This needs saying over and over. And the reason I share this with you is because the whole notion of an author being dead or being put aside can only work really well if you are Shakespeare and you are actually not dead. So the whole practices around reading and assuming the author is elsewhere assume that they are so present that they do not need to be animated into the context. And that when we do this and we bring authors, as we can see from the examples of Ocean and Van Neerven, when they come into our classroom without their announcement, without that history, without that cultural capital that's there, then there's another thing that happens. There's something quite different that happens with students being cross because this author doesn't have the history that they needed to have. So, importantly then, if we are teaching about Indigenous writing and we're teaching about literary sociability, we need to think differently about this whole BART framework of the author being outside, of the student mainly considering their own considerations of us making meaning together. Even our book clubs, we can see, those book clubs that exist in real life, they are different as well to what is probably happening in our classrooms, because we have a sense of an author being animated in book clubs and an engagement with that. So again, we see this different and this kind of decolonial work really important to us. I'm going to press on. So you can see here now what kind of knowledge, if the author is not dead, what context as literature as context and intertext do we have access to? What do we think about as literature as a method, which I'm going to explore? And what knowledge do we or do we not have access to? If method is around sociability and the way we make meaning, what knowledges, when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledges, do we need to consider in this light? So since 2019, Sarah Truman and I, Associate Professor Sarah Truman and I, have been working with the Literary Lab, and members, if you could just identify yourselves here. Yeah, thank you. There's a couple. And you're welcome to join us. So we are interested in these questions around the literary. And if you'd like to QR code the slide, you'll be able to see the Literary Lab there. And I should thank one of our Literary Lab members, Dr. Elaine Horton, for helping me put together these slides. Elaine's my research fellow. So we've been considering these questions. And one of the ways in which the lab totally galvanised was when we realised we needed to speak with authors in a way that was not consulting them about their work, but was thinking with them about their work. And when we think in literary education, what we are doing is often thinking about text selection, reading texts, working with our students, ensuring in my case that so many, and Velda and I have parallel lives in our two different continents, thinking about how we make sure certain texts get on the syllabus, but we often don't work with authors in this way, and maybe you do, and I'll learn from you in this way. So we had an incredible and fortuitous experience in the Literary Lab where I was invited by Alexis Wright, who is one of Australia's most preeminent Indigenous writers. She's won multiple awards, to come into a classroom she was running during COVID and just literally zoom in and observe how she was teaching her texts, because she'd heard that I was obsessed by the teaching of Australian literatures in their diversity. And through that connection, we then were introduced, this is Sarah Truman, to Sandra Phillips. And we began thinking with the teaching of Alexis's work with Alexis and thinking about notions of ways in which we might constitute a sociable literary practice. What kind of reading or book group were we? And this, I guess, is my question of method, because often when we're teaching literature and we're undertaking literary research, we employ those instruments to others, but don't do them ourselves. So we survey, we ask questions, we have focus groups, we analyse. But what is our shared reading? We're interested in the shared reading of others, but if literature is a method, then we can read as researchers literature as well, alongside the author, alongside each other. And so we began this thinking of what it is to do literary research with a not dead author in about 2021. And this paper, Power of Country, Indigenous Relationality and Reading Indigenous Climate Fiction in Australia, was our first foray into that work. But it began literature as method as research as method that hadn't been done by any of us quite in this way before. And the other thing that was important is Sandra's from literary studies. And so we were bringing together different disciplinary thinking around education, which I think has a value that we don't always talk about. We then kept working, and we now have the Reading Climate project, where we're thinking particularly about Indigenous knowledges, school English and sustainability. And I just want to speak really briefly about that because it brings together these threads of sociability, literature as method, and the kind of relational reading practices that begin to think about new knowledge. So first of all, when we began kind of putting these things together, we were very interested in, Alexis Wright talked about the fact that all of her texts, all Indigenous texts that she's written are actually about climate change, that there is no Indigenous text that's not alerting us to the fact that we're destroying the planet and country. We were thinking about sustainability, and we were thinking about school English, and we were thinking about, with our very live author, what is it to think about these considerations together. So we had a symposium, and it's online if you would like to see it. And in this symposium, we have Catherine Yusof, who's at Queen Mary College in Britain, who has the text, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, which is fantastic text, which brings together some of these ideas around climate. Claire Archer-Lean, Sarah Truman and Sandra Phillips and I from the lab. Ellen van Neerven, the writer whose text was very much abused by the students in HSC, writing to her. Tony Birch, another writer. So we have here this kind of conversation with writers thinking about what it is to be teaching literature in this time, not something taking their texts and then popping them out there, not having them come in and talk about the kind of key themes that will help students do well on an exam, but actually thinking about what it is to be producing literature at this time for social change, and what does that mean? So we came from that seminar with some very helpful things that we began to think about. And this is, if the author's not dead, which is powerful in Australian work, then we're actually able to animate land and country as well. Ellen van Neerven said to us, we, as in Indigenous people, read country. This is the most important literacy. So the author has to be absolutely animated. We're then animating land, and we're not separating author, land, country, text. These things are connected. So there's a literary sociability that is happening that we hadn't really been considering when we were thinking about sociability as being very much between people, sitting in a classroom or in a book club. We have a kind of sociable interaction that is happening beyond this. And we wrote a bit about this in our paper, Unsettling Critical Literacy. Barbara Comer invited us to write, and we had a great time really thinking about what is critical literacy when we have these kinds of interconnections. So where we went then is we thought, well, we've received some money from the Australian government, an Australian Research Council grant for thinking about climate, thinking about issues of sociability, thinking about these kinds of questions that I've been raising. And our plan was to then just kind of have a whole lot of different Indigenous texts and resources and have book groups and see if we could bring those book groups that were outside, not quite book talks or the Revolver Rave, but some kind of book club into professional learning of teachers, have teacher book clubs. This itself is not a radical idea, but we would then try and, outside of the classroom, think about what is professional knowledge for literature teachers and develop that through reading, not in order to teach a text, but to read for reading's sake. What a radical idea. We were going to then produce, as I said, lots of different texts, and we had to really strongly resist texts that we thought they could immediately teach, because we did not want the conversation to be about, how can I use this? We wanted the conversation to be, how do I think differently? How do I think differently if the author is alive? In ways that I haven't perhaps been trained to, because from 1977, we've all thought that the author's dead in various different ways. So what does it now mean to animate that live author? So what we decided to do in a moment, in fact, I must attribute this to my colleague Sarah Truman, is she said we should read Praiseworthy, which was in Alexis Wright's 720-page novel that won multiple awards in Australia, and we must read this with our teachers. We all thought she was mad, but we decided we would have a digitally mediated literary book group around Australia online, and we would read 720 pages of Praiseworthy. And we would do that to see what it would be to be reading with the notion of a live author connected to country, what it would mean for us as a group. And we invited in general readers into this. We invited literary studies academics into these book groups. And so our work around teacher professional learning was then not just about providing resources or teachers thinking about their own lives in the context of a text. All of that's very important work, but we were trying to do something differently, to think about sociability differently. And you can see a little bit here from Alexis Wright, and this is what she writes about the text. In Praiseworthy, there's wonderful, if you think you can read 720 pages of really dense prose that is extraordinary, I encourage you to do it. We have in fact been asked to run more book groups on Praiseworthy, and we might. She writes, I believe literature must meet the scale of what is happening in the world. We have to, even foolishly, believe that anything can be done in life or in literature with deep thought. So that notion of what is the purpose of literary teaching and how do we think together was most important. How do we survive an uncertain future, she says. In Praiseworthy, I looked at the reality of our circumstances and what it would mean to face the challenge of living on a burning planet and carrying our culture, Indigenous culture, and ancient wisdom into the future. So again, we can't say the author's dead, they're outside, that it's just meaning making that we're happening in our classrooms or with our texts or with our book group. This is a very different kind of connection. There we are there with Alexis Wright, and this was the awarded grant. Here are our partners. So you can see Alexis there in the middle with us, Melita Hogarth, Sarah Truman, Sandra Phillips, Claire Archeline, and Jackie Katona, who is Alexis Wright's long-term friend and a lawyer who reads Praiseworthy. And the reading of the text, Jackie's own views, Jackie's own experiences as an Indigenous person are reflected in that. I know I've got about 5 minutes, so I want to get to the next bit. So that then works. So what does the project look like? What is a project that's bringing together sociability with a live author, thinking about book groups? We have an advisory group entirely of authors and climate scientists. So as we read through Praiseworthy, as we read the book groups, and Claire Archeline and I ran them, many book groups, 33 book clubs last year, all recorded online. There is an advisory group where we share the data of those readings with them, where they read Alexis Wright as well, and they feed into their thinking about the role of the literary in society, in this society. Those writers are all Indigenous writers and climate scientists. The research team first off, when we decided to do this, we read Praiseworthy first, and we read it in our own book club. And we raised issues of the things that we didn't understand. We didn't read it just to prepare for the book clubs that we were then going to have with teachers. We read it because we wanted to understand what it would be to read and think differently with literature. I've talked about the teacher book clubs, and we're now in this last phase of the project moving into student book clubs. So teachers who were in the project last year have offered to then run student book groups using the same kinds of methodologies of the text that they are looking at, and they've chosen different Indigenous texts. So this was, and in fact, Grace did this excellent advertisement on Instagram, working as a research assistant in that. I should say that the author's been very live through this process. So in book clubs, and this was in the data of the book club, and I was reminded by my colleague Elaine about this, I said to Alexis, we're doing this, but I don't know if it's going to work. It's too big. Teachers can't read 720 pages. They're too tired. It's too much. And she said, we need a bigger book, Larissa. She was quite insulted. We need a bigger book. This book wasn't big enough for what I wanted to say. to Australian society. It's not big enough. It's not big enough for I want to say, so I shut up. That's Larissa after that. And so when we were working through this process and reading this incredible text, and you'll have to come to the session that Velda and I have with Debbie Myhill on Saturday if you want to hear any of the text, we then reminded ourselves of the live author and the role of the literary in social change at that time. Sarah Truman talked about this text being like a Trojan horse. There's donkeys in this text, or a Trojan donkey. The donkey coming in, people think they're reading a text, but it's actually changing the way they understand Australian society. It's most significantly changing the way they think about reading and their own discipline. And I guess this is where I will almost end, Andy. Let's just go on to our... I won't have the time to play it now. The notion that what happened in our book groups was what we would call unsociability. So the notion of being sociable and bringing a text together, of being able to make shared meaning, that was thwarted by this text. It has incredibly long sentences. It has references that teachers didn't understand, and many of them felt very frustrated by that. They felt frustrated that they could not access this text, that it wasn't going to be something that they could use immediately. And you might say, well, why do this text? What text do we teach? We teach texts that are canonical, that have been awarded. This text received the highest literary awards in Australia in the same year. So what is then the disconnect between that and understanding what we should actually read? So you can see some of the quotes there from our teacher participants. I'm getting frustrated with the amount of repetition. I've heard that joke before. Let's get on with it and move on with the action. I seem to be going in a circle back and back and back. I'm like, cut it out, cut it out. I'm finding that I'm getting frustrated. Oh, same one. We're going to move on. Usually I can skim and work out what's going on because everything is interconnected in the book. The sentences are so long, it's a continuous flow. You might think, well, this is just bad literature. But it in fact is not bad literature. It is in fact encouraging you to think about what is reading. Why do I expect that I need short sentences now? Why do I expect that the land and the country and its people must be represented in a certain way? Here we've got, I'm struggling to orient myself. I'm now letting go of my traditional reading strategy. I think I'm surrendering. I'm entering the space of surrender and going, okay, I just have to move through this and sit with the discomfort. So this is kind of the most contrary professional learning, if that's what it is, that these teachers had undertaken. But we did have the voice of Alexis coming in and talking about the text. We had various other voices coming in through our book groups. So we had a kind of surrender. So what does literary sociability look like now? Coming to conclusion. So if you remember, I started thinking about sociability as an idea that came from literary studies that was taken up by us, thinking about classroom practice. We know that sociability happens out there in the world in terms of book groups, but largely if we go into a book group, it's probably comfortable outside in the real world. We know that in our work, in our classrooms, we often want to introduce students to texts that will make them uncomfortable, that will advance, will change their knowledge. But we often don't think about the nature of whose voices are coming in, whose are not necessarily, and what is this sociable experience now. In Australia, teaching English and literature, you can't not think about unsettling the canon. Well, if you can, then it's a position of privilege that's not afforded to the majority of the culture. Literary sociability, what am I saying? Well, I'm saying it's authored. The author's not dead. It's a method which is deliberate and cascading. The conversation with the author is through direct access. Sometimes you can text them, paratexts, and it's part of kind of sociable arrangements. We're not pretending out there that the author's not alive. The living author is unsettling in this case, actually unsettling. Online and the digital, literary sociability is bringing these things together and making them possible, bringing together diverse, situated knowledges and understandings. Because we did the book groups right around Australia, we had people who'd never spoken to each other, never would again, who had very different views. and there was a great power in that. It's connecting institutions and publics. It is a research method. So for the first time in this project, we've thought about literature as a research method, as a methodology, as reading, as a teaching in its own right, as a kind of way of engaging with text, as method. And I just want to call out Grace's work, which is coming up in her soon-to-be submitted PhD, thinking with these ideas of interrupting English, of thinking about workshops. So we're almost there. So where are we? Here are some of our insights. The contexts and purposes of literary studies. We think about the settler context that I'm in and what it means to be having a citizenship around this. These things are important. Literary meaning making and text selection, which we often talk about, connected with literature as knowledge. Literature as method as sociability and relationality. So when we think about what insights reading climate gives us, for us, it's given us a way of thinking about the work and the purposes of teaching literature differently, building on and changing ideas of literary sociability that have probably been with us for a very long time. And I think I will finish there. Thank you, Andy.